Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha, and I enjoy talking about American presidents. I've been talking about Alexander Hamilton, and I'm going to continue to wrap up my discussion on Alexander Hamilton, who influenced our presidents, and of course, his philosophy of government, underpins the way our government is structured today. I'm going to compare him with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was his nemesis, right? He was the one who founded a party in opposition to Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. Now, Alexander Hamilton was a very principled man, and I've done videos mentioning how he was very suspicious and critical of the masses, and he wanted a restraint on direct popular vote in its capacity to select a president. Uh, on the other hand, his political opponent, Thomas Jefferson, um, you know, liked to pander to the popular vote, the liberty, freedom of the people. And I want to be able to um, show a contrast between their two political views and the way our constitution and our government and our notions of liberty have sort of uh, have sort of cohered over the times over time. So now Alexander Hamilton specifically uh, was very suspicious of the concept of exaggerated liberty. So, um, in our government, in the preamble to our, uh, in our founding documents, you see there are references to the concepts of liberty. We wanted to be free from the British Crown and things like that. Uh, so there are these notions of liberty. Now, Alexander Hamilton, however, he understood the the dangers of pandering to what's called exaggerated liberty. That's excessive liberty, excessive freedom, where human beings, the citizen, the individual doesn't exercise constraint, and this is common sense, right? Um, so in philosophy, in even legal concepts, there's this concept of positive liberty versus negative liberty. So positive liberty is the freedom of the individual from external constraints. When we think of positive liberty, we can consider freedom from government interference. So that's when the government is interfering with our rights. So hence we have the Bill of Rights, right? That's freedom. The government, us being free from the government uh, constraining our freedom of speech. For instance, the First Amendment. The government can't do this, can't interfere in this, right? So that's what's called negative liberty. Our relationship with the government. This freedom from external constraints. And when we're talking about external constraints, we're typically thinking about the government, right? And then there's positive liberty. The positive liberty is your freedom to exercise your free will, to be freedom to be self-governing, right? So your ability to do something, right? Now, of course, when we talk about your freedom to exercise your free will, we have to be cautious that this is not taken to an excess, right? So your freedom to do anything you want, you're free to do anything you want to do, right? Let's take it a bit further. Okay, so you can you can smoke if you want to smoke, take drugs if you want to take drugs, right? You have a freedom to do whatever you want. You're self-governing. But if you don't exercise some kind of restraint, right, or some external organ doesn't exercise some kind of constraint on you, um, your freedoms might cause harm. So for instance, if you're free to take drugs and you take cocaine and some other illicit drugs, I don't know, I don't take drugs, so I wouldn't know, but let us just assume you take some kind of illicit drugs and therefore you can't control yourself, and then you end up going to harm individuals. And so you're creating a menace, a danger to society, and you're constraining somebody else's freedom, because people have a right to be free from harm. So you take drugs because you choose not to limit your freedom, right? Not to govern yourself and limit your freedom, so that you don't constrain somebody else's freedom, because other people are free from harm just as you're free from harm. So these were things that our founding fathers had to grapple with, and Alexander Hamilton thought greatly about these things, right? The excesses of positive liberty, that's exaggerated liberty, not being able to put constraints on your liberty, on your individual actions. So that's why we have a government, right, to limit us, to put constraints if we don't want to, right? So there's some kind of authority, law that's constraining our actions, right? So these were things that Alexander Hamilton thought deeply about, and these were things he was concerned about, in his idea and his philosophy of government. A better educated person, a well-informed person, is able to exercise, better exercise, self-governance, right? Another another extreme example of this exaggerated liberty, that's where liberties are given free license and there's no constraints, there's this excessive liberty, is, for instance, you have a freedom to have sex with anybody you want to. And so you have sex with a 14-year-old, right? You have sex with a 14-year-old without considering that person's liberty. That 14-year-old, right, is still a minor. That 14-year-old has a guardian, a parent who is who has authority over her, right? And that 14-year-old is not, they're not properly mature. Their brain is not well formed to be able to self-govern, to be able to exercise their own freedom properly, to know what it is that they want to do, at 14. And so you're an adult, you're mature, you're over 18, you're exercising your freedom, you're able to manipulate that 14-year-old, right? And abuse that person's liberty just because you choose not to exercise constraints on your liberty. So we have negative liberty. We have a government making laws saying, well, you can't have sex with a minor. So this is the concept of balancing liberty, right? It's sort of like ordered liberty. Ordered liberty was not yet prominent during the time of Alexander Hamilton and our founding fathers, because ordered liberty, is Justice Benjamin Cardozo, who actually, who crystallized this notion of ordered liberty, I think it was in 1937 or something. I mean, in the 20th century, much later on, he crystallized this notion of ordered liberty. But these were things that Alexander Hamilton was considering, that we needed a balance, right? We needed a balance. We needed these restraints on liberty, because there were, we could see, he felt exaggerated liberty, excessive freedom could degenerate into chaos, into anarchy. These were his concerns. And, almost nihilism. And we have to be very careful. So nihilism is a concept where people just do not believe in obeying rules or established authority, right? And nihilism, the views of nihilists, it's normally a jump off, for anarchists. Anarchists, their predicate, starts with nihilism, this concept that nothing matters, right? This that you could do whatever you want, it doesn't matter, So these were things that Alexander Hamilton worried about, that if there was no restraint on liberty, this was what society could sink into, the chaos where human beings were not citizens, or individuals did not restrain themselves, they didn't believe in authority, or they didn't have values or beliefs. That's what nihilists, believe anyway, or don't believe. Nihilists don't hold on to they don't adhere to any beliefs, any values, and anything things are meaningless for nihilists. And again, like I said, it's a predicate to the thought system of anarchists and terrorists. And these were concerns that Alexander Hamilton had. And Alexander Hamilton had the horrors of the French Revolution to caution him, right, to inform his views on excessive liberty. The French Revolution, of course, that was when the peasants, the masses, they overthrew, in the name of liberty, freedom, they overthrew the monarchy, and they actually committed regicide. They killed their king and their queen, and of course a lot of the aristocrats were murdered. They were murdered, the guillotine. And what's interesting is while Americans watched with horror, because the French Revolution was supposed to have actually been inspired in part by the American Revolution. Of course, our founding fathers were inspired by French philosophers, right? French philosophers inspired our founding fathers, but we were the first ones to execute this notion of liberty and freedom from the crown, right? And then the French Revolution took it up a notch. They took it to the extreme, and they created disorder, chaos, anarchy by started murdering the aristocrats. It would be a good idea to actually mention how Europe was ordered and why our revolution, our independence from Britain was very significant. So the way Europe was originally ordered, right, by the time of our American independence was Europe had these established classification in society, right? And it wasn't a fluid society. You couldn't move into it. So you were born into things, and things evolved over time. So I might do a video later on to just talk more cogently about, what was called the Ancien Regime in Europe, right? So you have the monarchy at the top, right? So the king and the queen, the royal family, they're the top of society. And of course, under them, you have the nobility. So the nobility were the aristocrats, the lords, and the dukes, and whatnot. And under those people, or sort of equivalent, were the clergy. The clergy, right? The clergy normally came from the aristocratic background, because Europe had something called, especially Britain, they had something called primogeniture. Primogeniture meant that wealth, inheritance passed to the first son, right? So if a duke or an aristocrat had several children, the first son gets, inherits the wealth. The second son, the other children find their way. The daughters, of course, marry again into another aristocratic family, right? And so that's how it was. They recycled themselves. And this structure was set. Now, at the bottom of society were the peasants, right? The peasant class, the lower class. So if your parents were born were peasants, you're going to be a peasant as well. There was no such thing as, well, you work hard and then you move into another station. No. You're born into your parents' station, your parents' status, right? So you come from a royal family, you're a royal family. If you come from the aristocrats, you remain aristocrat, you marry into somebody else. But of course, because of primogeniture, the second son, he doesn't get the wealth. He might move into the clergy, might become a bishop, right? Bishops had a lot of wealth. The bad thing back then was that they didn't marry, until, the British, rebelled against the Pope. But those who remained Catholics, this was the situation. So the church had a lot of money. Of course, the peasants, they remained where they were. Peasants marry peasants, they remain peasants. That's how it was. Over time, of course, there was something that happened called the Industrial Revolution, 1750, right? And a merchant class started coming up. People who started to do business, they started to trade, they started to get influence, and they sought representation in Europe, in England. And over time, because of this Industrial Revolution, the 1750, the age of the machines, the age of greater mass production, urbanization, they needed new lands. And that's when imperialism and colonialism expanded. So the Americas, people moved to the Americas, to other territories in the world, right? And so and started creating new societies. And of course, that's how Americans, we felt it was time for us to break our shackles, our relationship with the crown. And so the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson is writing, all people are created equal. The pamphleteer Thomas Paine, he's arguing against the degeneracy of the monarchy and saying, well, let there be freedom, let there be liberty. So that's how America came about, right? So Alexander Hamilton, right, one of our founding fathers, he'd seen the extreme of this liberty, these notions of liberty from the French Revolution, what was going on. And he wanted a constraint, he wanted a balance, and he felt there was still the need to have a strong government, right? A strong government needed to not only put some restraints on individual liberty from getting out of hand, from going wild and crazy, but also it protects other people's freedom. It protects, it orders society. It creates public safety and law and order. So on the other hand, you see Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson just didn't seem to exercise the sort of restraints that Alexander Hamilton had regarding ordered liberty. Again, ordered liberty was not a popular concept then, but these restraints on exaggerated liberty, right? The need for negative liberty, the need for there to be a balance, right? The Greeks, the Aristotelian principle was the golden mean, that there's got to be a moderation, a moderate balance between individual liberty and, public order, public safety. There's got to be a balance. There's got to be it was called the golden mean. And while Alexander Hamilton focused on this concept a lot, of course, that was why, he argued for the Electoral College, in picking the president, right? On the other hand, his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, did not seem to exercise or even consider these restraints. Thomas Jefferson absolutely was ecstatic during the French Revolution. He supported revolutions. He supported the bloodletting at the time, right? There was just blood lost in France, and Thomas Jefferson was supporting it. He wrote openly about it, saying that yes, that it's good for society to have revolutions, for there to be blood, and it was like wild writing. Now, something else that I want to even talk about regarding, this positive liberty in terms of the way the scruples that these two men seem to live, order their lives. Everybody knows about Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. Of course, the man who wrote All Men Are Created Equal. He lived with slaves. He had slaves, owned slaves throughout his life, as many as 600 throughout his life. And that's one. So that was a contradiction there. There's the argument that, well, he probably did. He thought Africans, black people, were subhuman. They were not fully formed humans. But he was doing something problematic that was very contradictory. He was known, DNA evidence shows today that he was having sexual relations with his slaves, at least with one slave, Sally Hemings, because she had children for him, right? So you see, he didn't adhere to obeying the laws of the land. Virginia actually had an anti-miscegenation law. It said that blacks and whites couldn't have sexual relations, right? But he was violating this law, so he didn't exercise that proper self-restraint, right? He wasn't self-governing enough, right? Because he was obviously having sex he was violating a law. That's one. The other thing is, the man who said all men are created equal and was, advocating for equality, and some people might argue that, well, maybe he didn't believe that black people were fully formed human beings, that he thought they were not really people, they're not really men. But it's problematic if you thought that the black people were animals, were like beasts of burden. In fact, during slavery, blacks were owned like animals. They were property, right? That was chattel slavery, right? They were owned, held like chattel, and they were viewed as property. We all know about the 3/5 clause. People have argued, on the symbolism or the true meaning, saying that blacks were just 3/5, of a white man. Black men were just 3/5 of a white man. People have argued that, well, it was just for representation purposes. This was in our Constitution. Now, assuming Thomas Jefferson really believed that blacks were subhuman, they were not full human, right? So that's why he didn't think they qualified as, well, all men are created equal. But it's contradicted, right? It's contradicted. That theory is contradicted by the fact that he was having sex with a black person, with at least one black person, Sally Hemings, right? And by the way, Thomas Jefferson was a very intelligent man, right? He was also a farmer. He knows, there's certain animals you can't mate, right? So human beings, they belong to the same species, right? Class. That's why they can interbreed together, right? I don't know. Was Thomas Jefferson having sex with his animals? Was he having sex with his cows, with his sheep, or whatever, or his horses? Did he indulge in those things? Certainly not. I'd hope not, right? At least he didn't. His cows weren't giving birth to children for him. His horses weren't giving birth to children for him, right? But we know from DNA evidence that his African slaves were giving birth to at least one. Sally Hemings was giving birth to children for him, right? So his practices were far from his espoused beliefs. The dogma, the things he espoused, right? They were very far from what he professed, right? And this is where he differs significantly from Alexander Hamilton, and where Alexander Hamilton was superior to him. Now, someone he was very close to, he had been very close to Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, President John Adams, right? They were very close. Abigail Adams, when she'd heard the rumors that, well, he was having sex with his slaves, she asked him, and, she had met Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was actually an underage girl by the time Thomas Jefferson started having sexual relations with her. She was about 14 years old, it's estimated, right? He was old enough to be her father, right? She was about the age of one of his daughters. And Abigail Adams had actually met her, right, in Europe. As they had been friends together. In the Adams family and Thomas Jefferson had been friends in Europe. And at some point, Abigail Adams had actually briefly had custody of Thomas Jefferson's daughter when she was traveling. She had delivered them and with Sally Hemings to Thomas Jefferson. When they traveled from America to Europe to go to France to meet their father in France. And so Sally Hemings asked Thomas Jefferson because there are these rumors going around, and in fact the pamphleteer James Callender, right, had actually, whom Thomas Jefferson had hired to attack his opponents, especially Alexander Hamilton. But when James Callender felt deceived, by Thomas Jefferson, he started to publish that, well, Thomas Jefferson was having an affair and had children with Sally Hemings. And so, of course, Abigail Adams inquired, from Thomas Jefferson, that is there any truth to this? And of course, he denied it. So you could see that there was this lack of principle, right? His the notions of liberty exercised by Thomas Jefferson, it lacked any form of principle, any form of scruple, any form of informed constraint, right? He's having sex with an underage black person. He's violating the law by, breaking anti-miscegenation laws. He's doing all sorts of things, and he's not honest. He shows this dishonesty, right? And on the other hand, when you take a look at Alexander Hamilton, who was no saint himself, Alexander Hamilton at one point, he started having when he was Secretary of the Treasury, he started having an affair with a woman called Maria Reynolds. She was a married woman, and we don't know if, in fact, if it was set up originally by the husband, if it was a setup just to subsequently blackmail him. But he was having sex with her, even though he was married. Alexander Hamilton was married to one of the Schuyler family, one of the wealthiest, most important families in New York. But so it embarrassed his wife. Of course, initially he kept a secret. He was having this affair with her, but the husband now came and started to blackmail Alexander Hamilton, and he started to extort money from him, and Alexander Hamilton was paying him, to keep it silent. Of course, Alexander Hamilton was a public figure, and he still had presidential aspirations. Now, if this scandal had not happened, Alexander Hamilton, even though he wasn't born in America, he wasn't a natural born citizen because neither of his parents were Americans, he may have become president. And so that notion, that restraint on a natural born American citizen, a non-natural born American citizen cannot be president, that may have been done away with, right? Because of Alexander Hamilton, right? He had the stature to become president, but this scandal destroyed him politically. So Alexander Hamilton, when it was published, the calendar, they publicized this, that he was having an affair with this woman. And what happened was they accused him that he was actually using public money and using it to fund, this relationship or whatever. And they accused him of financial impropriety. So Alexander Hamilton did something that was, crazy. He wrote publicly. He wrote, a pamphlet. I think it was called the Reynolds Affair or something. He wrote a pamphlet anyway, admitting to infidelity with this woman, and he admitted that the husband had started to extort him, so he could prove that he had not embezzled any money, he had not dealt in any form of financial impropriety. He was exonerated he was cleared in terms of any speculation, any accusations of financial impropriety. But of course, the public admission that he was engaged in an extramarital affair, of course, not only humiliated his wife or embarrassed him, but it also it lowered the public's estimation of him, significantly, in terms of his integrity, So, but what I'm trying to do is compare Alexander Hamilton's actions, his principles in admitting to some kind of moral lapse, right? He admitted it publicly, to his disgrace. He admitted having an affair with a woman in writing. He wrote a pamphlet on it, to his public shame. But what about Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson was having this unlawful sexual relationship with this child, with his slave that he possessed. Obviously, she was in a relationship under duress, because a slave cannot have an informed relationship with her master, right? A slave cannot do that. That's coercion. He denied it throughout his life, but DNA evidence shows us today that he was having a relationship. So you see the difference in the demonstrated scruples, and it's, to me, Thomas Jefferson, he moves a lot towards nihilism, nihilistic behavior. Nihilists, they believe they don't place any premium on values, religious beliefs or anything. Thomas Jefferson, he was a deist, even though he claimed deists believe in a creator God. He believed in providence, a creator God. He created his own Bible, Jefferson Bible, and he removed references to the supernatural, right? But in his day, there are people, the church, many people accused him of being an atheist. Now, so you can see the need for Alexander Hamilton and the South, the need for them to place the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights to protect the positive liberty, right? Positive liberty and the restraints on negative liberty, right? Freedom from negative liberty. So the Bill of Rights, the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom from government, unlawful search and seizure, Fourth Amendment, and all these things, the Bill of Rights, protecting individual liberties, which was very important for Thomas Jefferson and, people in the South. On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton, wanted these constraints on liberty. So he wanted the Electoral College. He wanted a more powerful federal government, a more centralized federal government. So he wanted to be able to have this balance, the golden mean. And Alexander Hamilton was closer to that, to appreciating the golden mean. The golden mean is saying that, look, individual liberties have to be balanced with order, public safety. You needed an authority to be able to exercise some level of constraint, so liberty is not abused. Excessive liberty is a vice. It's a virtue to have a balance. This was Alexander Hamilton better reflected this virtue of the golden mean. I didn't think Thomas Jefferson appropriately adhered to this. Not in his lifestyle, not even in his presidency. His presidency and his demonstrated actions normally contradicted with things he espoused, right? Thomas Jefferson, who talked a lot about limited government, he opposed, right, an energetic, strong central government, and he wanted very limited government. When he became president, he actually exercised more. He centralized government more, right? He demonstrated very energetic federal government, executive power. You can see it with his Embargo Act of 1807, when he banned American ships from, going to any foreign ports, right? Of course, this was in reaction to British and French interference with our shipping and our trade. But there are many things he did. You could see it with the Louisiana Purchase. He knew that what he was doing was unconstitutional by not getting permission from Congress or the consent or authority or conferring with government when he executed the Louisiana Purchase. But he did it anyway. So he didn't show this proper restraint, this proper informed self-governance, right? The positive liberty as a virtue. He didn't show that virtue the way Alexander Hamilton did in his lifestyle and the way he in his philosophy of government. Alexander Hamilton better adhered to that virtue, that balance, that exercise of the golden mean, the moderation, the balance between our individual liberties and the government authority and public, which is responsible for public order and safety. My name is Olurotimi Osha. Let me stop here. This video has gone long. I'll try and talk a little bit more about our presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury, and fraud on the courts, which I'm experiencing in Montgomery County, Maryland. I was framed by Montgomery County Police, and false charges were filed against me, and the case number is C15CR23000731. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.